All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Monday Night Travel with Rick Steve Syrup. My name is Emily Burks, and I will be your host this evening as we road trip across the American South with my dear colleague and Rick's very first employee ever, Dave Hoerlein.
Thanks, Emily. Happy to be here.
And on that note, we are on to the fun part of our show, Dave.
Started.
As I mentioned, Dave will be our tour guide this evening. But before we get started, Dave, I was wondering we could talk a little bit about your backstory here at Rick Steve's Europe. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you are Rick's very first employee ever. And so I was wondering if we could talk about your story, how you came to join Europe through the back door, and what you do at Rick Steve's Europe now.
I would be happy to. I met Rick in 1982. He was teaching non-credit classes at the University of Washington's Experimental College. He had a five-part travel class. I lapped it up. I was buying everything he was selling, but his handouts weren't the greatest because he was drawing his own maps with a ballpoint pen. Say they're kind of primitive. And I got my courage up after class one day and said, Rick, your class is great, but your maps could use some work. And that's how I got my foot in the door. I did maps. He asked me to help him lead tours, done travel consulting, different things over the years. And I'm back now just doing maps and loving it.
And I was so grateful that you provided this photo of you, I believe,
Okay.
leading a tour.
Yeah, the big camera and the short shorts date that as early 80s. It's pretty easy to see.
Well, it is definitely a treat. Thank you for sharing. And before the show, kind of put my PI hat on and I did a little digging on you. You've known a lot of our coworkers for a while, and our friend, Lisa Friend, let me know that you actually started as a trained architect in your career. So,
I did.
yeah, how did you go from trained architect to self-trained cartographer?
Well, I knew how to draw. I mean, anybody who's an architect can know how to draw. And I think I took that drawing ability and clarity and just applied it to the map. So a lot of the success of a map, I think, is having the right information and not having too much information, kind of that less is more philosophy. And I think that really applies well to not just map making, but also to Rick's travel style, which is he's basically telling you what you need to know and not bogging you down with things you don't need to know. And the maps reflect that.
I totally agree. And I would say this is one of my favorite pastimes at work is hearing the stories of, I would say, the glory days from some of my colleagues who were there from the beginning. And so I was wondering if you had any stories you could share with us from when you first got started.
Let's see, a story from the Stone Age. Rick always says, and I agree that the good old days are now, so it's fun and great now. But back in the day, we had our moments, and I'm thinking about a night in Venice, a warm night in probably 1983. We were standing on the bridge where you can see the famous Bridge of Sighs, and Rick was talking about that. Our hotel owner at the time, Juliana, was with us, and he was chatting it up with women on the tour. And then random men would come by and give women on the tour a smooch, and then they would head off. I'm not sure if they were friends of the hotel owners or just really were random men, but it was such a magical night in Venice, and I started looking over the other side towards the lagoon, and I wondered what it would be like to jump in right now. And we all get these urges from time to time, and I suppressed it for a while, and finally I couldn't stop it myself. I just stripped to my underwear and just boom. And so the group heard this splash, and where's Dave? And there's just a pile of clothes and some shoes there. I jumped out, kind of took a bow, and when they applauded, and then joined the group again. And then I think I air dried, and then we headed off to our gondola ride. It's just a magical night in Venice.
I was really hoping you would tell that story. I love that story. And I'm also glad you got that swim in back then because I'm not sure you'd get away with that now. So
No, I think the laws are a little different.
yes, a little stricter. All right. Well, Dave, the reason you are here tonight is because you recently took a trip that was filled with cultural experiences, good food, and memorable sights. And you were not in Europe, you were in the American South. And so I understand you've prepared a trip report with us.
I have, and I'm excited to share it.
Let's hit the road.
So the trip started in Kansas City and went to Oxford, Mississippi, the home of Ole Miss. Every trip is shaped by different factors. And the question I got asked when people knew I was going is, Dave, why would you want to go to Mississippi? And there's nothing against Mississippi. It's a great state with wonderful people, but it's just not maybe on the top tier of sites that you might want to see if you were going to travel in the US. But I always believe myself that each human being should have one thing they don't need to explain to anybody else. You can just do it as long as that behavior is not self-destructive or hurting anybody else. Um, my thing is a love of college football. In particular, my team, the Washington State Cougars. We're kind of an underdog team, but well loved by our fan base. And when I heard we were playing at Ole Miss in Mississippi in October of last year, I said, I'm in. I'm going to that game. My wife wasn't necessarily so sure, but when she found out that we were close to Bentonville, Arkansas, where the famous Crystal Bridges Museum is, she thought, well, I'll go to Ole Miss if I can go to Crystal Bridges. So the deal was on and the trip was set. We had to figure out where to fly in. Kansas City seemed to be the close place, and they have a great World War I museum, so I was looking forward to seeing that. And then we flew out. We were going to fly out of Memphis initially because that was the closest place to Oxford. Then our son, who goes to college in Salt Lake City, could join us for that time. And he loves football too. Not so much art, but football he loves. And it was easier for him to fly out of Nashville back to Salt Lake. So we changed our departure place to Nashville. So that's kind of how the trip takes shape. And I find that fascinating, not just this trip, but any trip, you know, how does the trip take shape with some must-sees, with some along the way type sites, figuring out the flights and kind of tailoring it to your own needs. And so this is the trip. I think it's interesting also to start with thinking about what your travel style is. These are some things that are important to me when I travel, and they may be important to you, or maybe have totally different or things that you want to see. I think it's important when you find your travel partner that they share at least some of these things, because if not, there can be some conflict. But these are the things that I love to travel. We'll talk about these things and more along the way.
Or before we move on,
Yes.
tell me more about flexibility. What does that look like in practice?
You know, that's interesting because when I started, Rick was completely against any reservations, hotels, museums, any of that stuff. To be fair, it was the 80s and you didn't have to have reservations all the time. These days, I think it's different. So I think it's important in general to have reservations, some museum reservations if they're needed. But for example, restaurants, I almost never make a reservation. I mean, you can always read about these great places, but I really believe in talking to locals and kind of figuring out what's going to work best and finding places that way. So as much as I can be flexible, I try to be.
I love that. It's leaving room for spontaneity.
Yes. And that's another thing that's important to share with your travel partner. Whoops, sorry. So we started off in Kansas City, and then this is a trip to the South. You could argue that Missouri and Kansas City isn't really the South. It's kind of a bridge state to the South, but that was, again, the easiest place to fly into. So my wife, Yana, and son, Nils, we headed off into our adventure. First thing I noticed in Kansas City is the color red. I've never been to a town where so many people wore the colors until the Seahawks went to the Super Bowl, and then the town was awash here with blue and green, but red was everywhere. Also pink, and I couldn't figure out why everybody was wearing pink, and I stopped this couple, and I said, what's up with the pink in Kansas City? And they said, well, Chapel Roan is in town. That didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know who Chapel Roan was. My son did, but she's a pop singer who speaks very much to the LGBTQ community, and she's from nearby in Missouri somewhere. And so she was having a 2-night stand in Kansas City, and the town was full of people in pink. It was fantastic.
Have you listened to Chapel Roan now?
My son did play a song, something about a pink pony club
Yes.
on the road trip later on, and it was catchy. Yeah. And I saw this poster, and obviously she's speaking to a community that living in the Midwestern part of the U.S., somewhat conservative. You know, her message, I think, is really important. And this poster that I saw, or actually this flag, really resonated with me the whole trip, in fact. On the plane, We didn't have any reservations for dinner. There was a kind of a large man with tattoos sat next to me, and he was going to Kansas City. And I struck up my courage and I said, "Are you from Kansas City?" He goes, "Yeah." Where should we eat? We're looking for barbecue and steak. And he thought about it for a second. He said, "Joe's for barbecue, Jess and Jim's for steak." He didn't say another word the rest of the flight, but he gave me those tips. So we got into town, checked into our hotel, and headed over to Joe's Barbecue. I was in heaven here. Seattle, we have great salmon, we have good seafood and things, but we don't really have good barbecue. And so Joe's was really a revelation to me.
And do you remember what your order was here?
You know, I kind of do. I know my wife had she had pulled pork. My son had ribs. I'm looking at the menu or looking at this picture trying to figure it out. I had something I'd never heard of before called burnt ends, which are tips of the fatty part of the brisket cut into cubes, and the the an aficionado would call them meat candy, and they are, again, we're not talking for vegetarians here, but it was fantastic. Then I also had some kind of a special sandwich that had let's see, smoked provolone, and I think it also had some of the beef brisket in it and some other things. So we ordered way, and I had banana pudding for dessert. We had way too much food, and we loved every second of it. Joe's, in fact, is in a gas station, so you can see it's not a fancy place, but it was fantastic. The next night was Jess and Jim's, the steakhouse my seatmate had recommended. And you walk in, you know a place is serious when there's a refrigerated case that shows you the various cuts of steak. Kansas City steak is really known. Kansas City strip is their main thing. It's a marbled steak and just super flavorful. So we really enjoyed both of our meals in Kansas City. I'm going to talk about some universal travel tips along the way. And the first one is what I just mentioned to you, is always ask locals for advice. They're your best source of information, and they love to give you their tips. Kansas City was really a beautiful city. I loved the architecture. This is their old train station, no longer used as a train station, but still for exhibit space. They had a great market. Another great tip is when you travel into a town, especially on a Sunday or a Saturday, often any city, any town is going to have a nice market. In Kansas City, a city market was really, really great. I like to be active when I travel, so I like to rent bicycles with local bike shares, and took a trip along I think this was the Missouri River. Again, I love architecture, so I thought their library was fantastic with these steps that looked like books, and then the books along the facade. But we were headed for the National World War I Museum, and I'd had a good friend of mine, Bruce, had told me about this years ago, and I'd always wanted to go. In France, in the town of Caen, there's a World War II museum, which I think is the best museum of its type that I've seen in the world. I would put this museum up in that category. Really fantastic. You start by walking across a plexiglass bridge, and there's all these poppies below you. And an attendant in the museum came up to me and he said, "Did you know each one of those poppies represents 1,000 military lives lost in World War I?" I go, "No." And he goes, I go, "How many poppies are there?" And he said, 9,000. So the simple math, 9 million military casualties. There were, of course, way more when you consider civilians. The museum is super well done. They have a lot of great, colorful, interesting exhibits. Talks about the main aspect of the war, which was, of course, the Western Front, that were both armies kind of bogged down in that trench warfare. And they do a good job of giving you interesting ideas of what it might have been like to be in that horrible trench warfare. But I think the museum is interesting too because it talks about other aspects of war we don't normally think about. On the left there, you could buy a T-shirt that said, "We served too," showing the various animals that lived and died in the war. The slide on the right, image on the right, is talking about something that we now call PTSD, but I think it wasn't necessarily known as that. But it's more the effects of war on the survivors, and those things that you would take home with you. I thought that was very, very powerful. I thought this was powerful too. It was actually an old poster for war bonds, and it says at the top, "Americans all." And you can see on the right all those different names of people of different nationalities, those people that built America. And I think especially in these days with our ICE and everything, I think we've kind of lost track that it was immigrants that really built this country, served and died so we can have our freedoms. After that, though, I have to admit I love art. I've traveled a lot in Europe, into a lot of museums, and I am an unabashed Caravaggio completist, meaning my goal in life, one of them, is to see every painting that Caravaggio did. He's a painter, Italian Baroque painter from the 1600s. The the money there on the left is the old Italian 100,000 lira bill that had his face on it. He was an interesting figure. He was on the run much of his life. He was accused of murder. Most of his friends were prostitutes and street people. He used them for his models, but his style is really characterized by something called chiaroscuro, an Italian term that means light and dark. And the way he could use shadow and that real heightened realism really makes him special. And one of his paintings of St. John, young St. John, was in, of all places, Kansas City. And I thought it was fantastic. It's the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art.
Do you know how many more pieces you have
You
until
know,
you reach?
I'm about halfway through because he was on the run much of his life. His work is kind of scattered about Europe too, so it's a little hard to kind of nail
Hmm.
everything down. But not just Caravaggio in this museum. There's fantastic Monet, um, works by Oldenburg on the left and Rodin on the right. And also an American artist I like quite a bit, Thomas Hart Benton, who's also from this area, actually lived in Kansas City. This is his typical kind of American landscape in the regional style, curvy and colorful. He was also sent to Hollywood by Life magazine and painted this very satirical look at Hollywood and all the things that that represents. And all these blonde bombshells there. And I read somewhere where Jean Harlow, the famous Hollywood actress, was from Kansas City and recently died. And some people might think it's a representation of her. I saw that he lived in Kansas City, and on the way out of town, we stopped at his house and studio. And I thought that was really interesting too. He's not nearly as short as his cutout appears to be on the right, but I loved his self-portrait on the left. You talk to, or you read quotes by Picasso, Van Gogh, and others, and they talk about how self-portrait, the brush can reveal much more than a camera can. And I love the feeling in the self-portrait here. But we were heading south. And I noticed we were bisecting Route 66. That's been maybe the greatest American road trip of all times, Chicago to LA. We stopped in Joplin. We went to a sports bar and watched part of the Seahawk game. And then I found this mural on my phone and we checked this out. And that was a lot of fun to see too. But we were headed for Arkansas. So Kansas City down to Bentonville. That's in the northern part of Arkansas in the Ozarks. Why Bentonville? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of Walmart, and where Walmart got its start was in Bentonville, 1950. Sam Walton opened this five and dime store, and it turned it into this incredible empire. If you're interested in Walmart, you can go to this storefront and go in. And it's actually a museum to all the things that he did. But what we wanted to see was to visit the Crystal Bridges Museum. And speaking of another travel tip, giving each person ownership. I talked about my wife wanting to go to Crystal Bridges, and I was all for that too. But as much as each person in the travel group can have something to call their own, the trip is going to be more of a success. Crystal Bridges is a museum it's the brainchild of Alice Walton, Sam Walton's daughter, and it focuses on American art. It's in a ravine outside of, well, actually real close to the town of Bentonville, where the river they've kind of dammed a little bit, and these pavilions of glass, hence the name Crystal Bridges, are kind of floating in the river there. And there's some Dale Chihuly glass balls and kind of in the foreground. We were really lucky. Through a friend, I got in contact with Rod Bigelow, the executive director of the museum, and there's nothing better than getting a tour from someone who really knows the place. Getting back to another travel tip, use those local contacts. We all have them. Seek them out. It's going to make your trip more valuable, more interesting. American art, I admit I don't know a lot about it, but I've seen that portrait of George Washington as we have. I've seen Rosie the Riveter by Norman Rockwell, another Rockwell, which is kind of hearkening to the Civil Rights Museum that we would see later on the trip in Memphis. George O'Keeffe on the left, Grandma Moses on the right, Dale Chihuly, Alexander Calder. There's so much great American art. It was really fun to see that. It's interesting how you go to a museum and some paintings just speak to you. For some reason, this painting spoke to me. It's something to do with reading the news of the Mexican-American War. And I love the face on this guy reading the newspaper. And it reminds me, because my wife is Danish, that's the same look she's had on her face every day for the last year or so when she reads about Greenland in the newspaper. So that was very evocative to me. And interesting to have this Rod give us a tour because he talked about the fact that, first of all, the museum is free, which means the museum can, in some ways, do what they want. But they're in a relatively conservative part of the country. So people ask questions like, why is art full of naked people? And those are good questions to pose when you're thinking about art. Rod could also see that our son Nils, he likes art well enough, but he was looking for something different. And they had a special exhibit called, what was it called? Get in the Game, with kind of fun things like this table they called Ping Pond, a four-person ping pong table with no net, but a pond in the middle with a little plastic lily pads. And when your ball goes in, then you got to start a new one. He also told us about this tapestry that was kind of cool, also part of this special exhibit. And I love basketball, so I love the NBA jerseys, all the color. And I looked at it more closely, and it reminded me of something I'd seen before. And then I realized what it was. It's a take on Picasso's Guernica, that famous painting in Madrid. So you can see the bull there, of Chicago Bull, and all. It was fascinating to think how art can sort of combine the old and the new. And of course, for me being an architect, I really wanted to see Frank Lloyd Wright's house. It wasn't built there. It was built in New Jersey, I think, and then disassembled and then built here again. And so, if you're an architect in general, you're a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. And so to see this museum or this house in the museum was really fantastic. And to be able to go inside too, the way he's able to bring the interior and the exterior together.
Yeah, I was really excited to have you on since you are a trained architect. And so I know that architecture and urban design is something that you always look for when you're putting together an itinerary. And I would say, how do you seek out those interesting things for one? And is there any times on this trip where you feel like you really stumbled upon something that surprised you and just wowed you?
It's a good question. Yeah, I always have kind of a bucket list of things that I want to see, and I'd always wanted to see one of these Wright houses. They're actually called a Usonian house, and he had this idea that this would be a house that the middle class could afford, and he'd build them all over the country. They only ended up building like 60 of them. And just when I looked at the Crystal Bridges, site, they mentioned that you could visit this, but I think architecture is sort of all around us. It's everywhere, and I think stumbling into things, sometimes the things that you didn't plan on seeing can be the most important. But I really love this, and of course, Wright was kind of like a lot of great architects, was kind of a control freak. So he needed to design all the interiors, the silverware, the
Mhm.
furnishings, and all that. So it's sort of a kind of a dictatorial style. I don't know what it's like to live in a house like this, but it's fun to be able to visit
Mhm.
it. And Rod, the director, also told us about this place called Skyspace on the way out. So we stopped, and it was it reminded me kind of the Pantheon. It was this little kind of sheltered building with a round circular roof. And I'd heard also that it was called the Way of Color, but it wasn't colorful when I was there. And they said, then I read further, and at dusk and dawn, if you go there, you can see it change color with LED lights that kind of mirror the amount of daylight going on. At this point, my travel group, my wife and son, were done with any more art, and so we wanted to go home and have dinner. But I decided I'd go back the next morning at dawn. And you got to know me, I'm not an early riser at all. But I got to see this thing. It sounds so cool. So I went and I waited in the dark. And finally, it started to get light. I could hear the birds. I could see stars. And then all of a sudden, imperceptibly, it didn't happen all at once. All of a sudden, it's green. I go, wow, that's cool. I was the only one in this space. Yellow, and then orange, purple. It was the most Zen-like experience I've had recently in my life. And just kind of a reminder that I didn't plan on seeing this at all until I stumbled upon it the day before. So it's the idea of keeping that flexibility, and you may come across something cool. Leaving Bentonville, we headed down through the Ozarks. Now, I'm a big fan of what they call blue highways, meaning not interstates, but those back roads. And when I heard there was a road called the Pig Trail through the Ozarks, I said, I'm in. I wasn't sure if my wife and son were, but they went along with it. And the Ozarks are pretty. I will say, talking about here travel relativity. I'm from the state of Washington, where we have fantastic, jagged, snow-capped mountains, pretty much year round. So the Ozarks, while they're beautiful, I wouldn't probably seek them out as a mountain range to see, but they are pretty. And I've heard if you come back in late October with the fall colors, they're fantastic. So we followed the Pig Trail down to Little Rock, which is our next step. Little Rock, I wanted to go there because of the Little Rock Nine, the nine students that broke the color barrier in 1957 at Central High School. And there's an exhibit next to Central High School, which is still there and still looks exactly the way it looked, back then. Unfortunately, that exhibit was closed because of our government shutdown, which messed a lot of things up for travelers, not just travelers, but plenty of other people too. But still, it was interesting, I think, to be there and look at some of the displays and just feel that part of history. And so that brings me to another travel tip: is be prepared to pivot. If you can't see the things you want to see, find some other things. I also, on my bucket list, was to see the Clinton Library in Little Rock, which is a beautiful building. We loved walking around it. We would have loved to gone inside it, but it was closed for the government shutdown. And I think whatever your politics are, there's probably nothing more embarrassing than a government shutdown, because you feel like if anything, government should be able to compromise and come to some resolution. And again, I'm speaking about just the simple inconvenience of being a tourist, but there were plenty of people that were affected in way more serious ways than we were. So we left Missouri, and then we crossed into the true South, which is Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee. I guess I was going to talk about the South a little bit. I'm no expert in the South by any means. I do love the band Leonard Skinner, and I think pecan pie is one of the best things ever invented. But I really don't know much about the South. But I kind of think that in this country, anywhere, you can throw a rock at two places and connect the dots and come up with a fantastic trip. And so far, we were loving our trip to the South, and now we were diving into some, I think, the most interesting parts, including Memphis. I think it's important when you travel to recognize baggage, and I'm not talking about physical baggage, but the mental baggage that we carry. This was a time, back in September when our president was talking about how dangerous Memphis was, sending National Guard. I knew Memphis had a high crime rate, so I was a little nervous in some ways going there. I booked specifically a Airbnb type place in an apartment with secure parking and all that. But I tell you, we got to Memphis and I didn't feel unsafe in the least bit. I felt more unsafe in many parts of my hometown, Seattle, than I ever did in Memphis. I know there may be parts of Memphis that might be dangerous. All I'm saying is, in the parts that we were in, we didn't see it at all. It was just a lovely city. Built on the bluffs of the Mississippi, and those bluffs are still there. In fact, there's a wonderful bluff walk that you can take. This is about a 5-minute walk from the place that we were staying. This wonderful pedestrian pathway with joggers and people just walking along, enjoying the views. Down on the river, there's a park, a large park that really takes full advantage of the beautiful Mississippi. And I tell you, that sunset in Memphis is one of those most memorable parts of the whole trip for me. If you like music, Beale Street is famous for, and the cool thing about it is a lot of these places don't have cover, so you can kind of go from bar to bar. You love the blues, that's famous for that, but all kinds of other music too. So really a blast to go to Beale Street. But we were going there to see the National Civil Rights Museum, housed in the Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King was shot in 1968. You start by being outside and you see the wreath right in front of the room where he was. Again, the museum is built inside a motel, but you wouldn't really know it. It's very skillfully and architecturally created, so you sort of walk through all these various spaces. And you learn a lot about parts of our history that aren't so pleasant. But I think it's important as Americans that we visit places like this. And it's made me feel really proud to live in a country that we can show ourselves warts and all and learn about our shared history. And again, some parts of this history are not pleasant at all. This is the Little Rock Nine getting harassed as they went to school. You learn about heroes. Rosa Parks on the left, James Meredith on the right. He's the one that broke the color barrier at Ole Miss, in fact, in 1962. And again, very creative exhibits. Like you walk onto this one bus, there's a statue of Rosa Parks there, and then the bus driver starts yelling at her and insulting her. And it just it takes you back to a time. Whoops. Learn about things like the Green Book, the true Green Book that used to exist so that, Black people knew where they were safe to stay. And of course, I've seen the movie Green Book, as I'm sure a lot of you have, and it's definitely a Hollywood version of that. But I think it hits pretty hard too, that movie does, and gives you kind of a feeling for what those times might have been like. And you end on the balcony where MLK was shot. And I'm 67 years old, so what was I, 9 when this happened? And here you are on this balcony. The shots were fired by James Earl Ray from one of those brick buildings, and it's pretty powerful. And it's a museum that makes you feel a little bit ashamed. It also makes you feel hopeful for what can happen, and also makes you think about what Martin Luther King's legacy is. And part of that was when you see something that's not right, our job as Americans, if we're so moved, is to protest. And it made me feel good that back in March, some friends of mine and my wife were protesting in Seattle. And I think MLK's legacy is that idea of peaceful protest. And that's an American right, one that many people have lived and died for. We're going to segue now to something a little different. The King, because of course, Graceland is right on the outskirts of Memphis. And while I think the Civil Rights Museum is something every American should see, and I think Graceland is something every American should see too. The question is, how much time do you need to spend there? I'll give you a quick tour of it. Basically, there's kind of 4 quadrants. Upper left is the parking lot. Upper right is the Elvis Graceland Hotel. The 2 main things that most people want to see would be over on the bottom right, that purple area. That's the Graceland Mansion that you tour. Then you go back to that area on the bottom left, which is kind of pinkish, and that's this incredible series of Elvis museums. And literally an Elvis fan, a true fan, could spend the entire day there. If you all you want to do is see the Graceland Mansion, an hour and a half will do it. We were there about 2.5 hours, and that was plenty, especially for my son, who didn't even really know who Elvis was before we started. You may think I'm a bad parent because of that, but anyways. So we went to Graceland, the mansion. That was great. It's not as fancy as you think it might be. I know many people in the audience have seen it, so I'm not telling you anything new. But it is interesting to see the various rooms and the opulence of the day. Then you go to the museums, and again, there's a museum of cars. There's his planes. There's his costumes. There's Colonel Parker Museum, Elvis in the military. You could literally spend all day there, but we were okay, like I say, with just a short time there. And back in our B&B, we had Elvis on the wall, so Elvis was kind of everywhere. So now we're leaving Memphis, heading down to Oxford. That was the reason this trip got started to begin with, even though there were plenty of detours along the way. And I'd never been to Mississippi before, and I got to tell you, I loved every minute of it. We went to I'm always a sucker for a detour. We saw a sign for Indian burial mounds or Native American burial mounds. And so we took a little side trip and saw this on the way. And we always think America has only recent history, but these date back to the time of the end of the Roman Empire. So it's kind of interesting to think that America has a lot of history if we just know where to look. But we are off to Ole Miss. And 2 things I got to tell you. One of them is Oxford is known as the Velvet Ditch because, as it was explained to me, it's a very comfortable, cozy place to go to college, and you love it so much you never want to leave. I even saw a T-shirt that somebody had on that said, Ole Miss, the best 5 or 6 years of your life. It kind of cracked me up. The other thing about Mississippi is it's a long word, so a lot of the locals call it the SIP, the SIP. So you kind of learn that one too. And off we went to the SIP. Oxford is a beautiful town. If you were going to create a college experience, from scratch, hard pressed to do any better than Oxford. It's a wonderful, typical Southern town with a courtyard, with a square, with a courthouse in the middle, surrounded by arcaded streets with bars and restaurants and bookstores and all kinds of things that a college town needs. But we were there to go to a football game, and Oxford is famous for its tailgating, particularly a place called the Grove, a park near campus where they set up all these booths for people. We were there the night before, so it was not much commotion going on, but you could sort of see something big was going to happen. And the next day, the Grove was awash in people, mainly Ole Miss fans. There were quite a few my Cougar brethren there as well. We definitely had some fun there. They have this chant there. The chant of my college we say is "Go Cougs." If you're a Michigan fan, you say "Go Blue." At Ole Miss, they say "Hotty Toddy." I never could get a great explanation of what it is, but I know it's a chant and it's kind of their rallying cry. And I just read it for you. I can't really chant it, but it starts by somebody saying, "Are you ready?" And then they go into this thing. Hell yeah, damn right. Hotty toddy, gosh almighty, who the hell are we? Hey, flim flam, bim bam, Ole Miss, by damn. I heard this day and night for 48 hours we were there. And people dress up to these games. It's incredible. I mean, they really look nice. So we had to up our game and look nice too. We did our best. That's my family there on the right, my good friend Larissa and her husband John and their daughter Jordan, who came along for the ride. We just had a great time in the Grove. I could have stayed there all day, but we had a football game to go to.
You almost got lost in the Velvet Ditch.
I almost got lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, there actually is a bar named the Velvet Ditch, so it's very, very, very fitting. But the game was great. My team played valiantly, but didn't win. But boy, did we have fun! Beautiful day. We just loved every minute of it. The fans couldn't have been nicer. And if you don't remember the words to Hotty Toddy, if you buy a drink cup there, it's right there in front of you. We stayed in this incredible B&B. I really one of the nicer places I'd ever stayed before. It wasn't cheap, but I wanted to be really close to the action between town and the campus. They're about 10 minutes apart. We were right in the middle. But I tell you, this place, some of the rooms were as nice as anything I saw in Graceland. It was pretty crazy.
Do you have any tips for finding locally owned accommodations like this? I'm curious how you came across this charming B&B.
Honestly, kind of by chance in this case, I'd found a place. I like to look on different things, like Airbnb, different other B&B sites, sometimes booking.com. I didn't find it in any of those. But I did find by looking at a map of Oxford, you can kind of, scroll in and all of a sudden I saw this really nice B&B close to town, close to campus. So I booked it and everything was great. And a month before I got a letter from this B&B saying, we've had some personal problems and we're going to have to close. Are you kidding me? It was my whole thing was this was the part of the trip I was most interested in. I picked this location perfectly. And they said, well, we got a few suggestions, but they were all kind of far out of town. So I just booked a cheap motel in Oxford, just thinking, oh man, it's not going to be so great. And then a couple days later, they said, we have this friend that has a place that has an even better location than ours. And that was this place, the so-called Oxford House. That was our host in the background, Lauren, her husband, Patrick. We got there, we were kind of in a hurry and we were hungry. And she just said, why don't you sit down? And you got to forgive my Southern accent. Why don't you sit down and take it easy and you can get a beer in the fridge out by the pool and Patrick's going to make you some ribs. Does that sound good? Yes. And so they had this great communal room where we could meet people that were staying there, people from Alabama and St. Louis and different places. So that was really a great part of it too, is the communal aspect of it. And Lauren also told me about a place where you could get the Oxford specialty chicken on a stick. And she said, you don't want to go too late at night because it gets kind of crazy. It was crazy. Again, like Joe's in Kansas City, it's housed in a gas station. You walk into this gas station, packed with college kids, and you get chicken on a stick, which is just like it sounds. And I'm not going to say it was the greatest thing I've ever had. A lot of times specialties, they're not always the greatest thing you've ever had, but I will say it's the best chicken on a stick I've ever had in Oxford, Mississippi. And if you go there, you got to have it. And so that brings me to this tip of embracing the lowbrow, like chicken on a stick, but knowing when to splurge, like staying at that B&B, the Oxford House. The Grove the next morning was eerily quiet. It's amazing how fast it got set up and how it was at its peak. And then the next morning, completely back to the park that it was. I took a walk through the Ole Miss campus by myself. My wife and son were smartly sleeping in. And of course, college campuses tend to be fairly quiet on a Sunday morning. I don't think I saw more than a handful of people.
Especially after a football game.
Exactly, exactly. But I did come across this, and this is a memorial to James Meredith, who broke the color barrier at Ole Miss in 1962. And it kind of made me think, gosh, the day before I was watching a football game where probably three-quarters of the players were black. And it just kind of made me think about a lot of things and just how lucky you are to live in a time when things are changing, but how much more change needs to come. So after Oxford, we were headed to Nashville. And of course, I'm always a sucker for the detour and things along the way. I wanted to see a Civil War site. And so Shiloh was on the way. And again, speaking of this idea of balancing the journey versus your destination, and sometimes the journey is even more interesting. And our journey, we were going through Tupelo, Mississippi, and I remembered Tupelo. That's where Elvis was born. So, of course, we saw these signs, Elvis birthplace, and so we followed those signs. And it was closed, not for a government shutdown, but because, well, the attendant there told me, well, it's on account of the church. We don't like to open before noon because we mess up all the parking. So I thought that was thoughtful of them. But the guy told me quite a bit about what was going on there, including Elvis's house. He goes, it's a shotgun house. And I go, what does that mean? He goes, well, you could open the front door and the back door and shoot a gun through it, and the bullet would go right through. So honestly, I found this as moving and as interesting as Graceland. Just thinking about where Elvis came from, and of course, we all know the opulence of his life. But I think seeing where someone comes from, I think, is a fascinating thing. Some aspects of the South that I wasn't really prepared for. The idea that in a gas station, they have coolers with beer that you can just grab and go as you head out to your car. All these giant crosses throughout the landscape, I thought was really, really, really fascinating too. These are things that we don't see in Seattle. Shiloh. I'd never really been to a Civil War site before, and unfortunately, because of the government shutdown, we couldn't go to the visitor center. But this was a very powerful place to be. You could drive through the area, and there were definitely interpretive stands and things, and then the cemetery. I met a guide there who was off duty because the place was closed, but he told me about the battle, 2-day battle with Grant was on the Union side, and I forget the name of the Southern general, but he was killed at the end of the first day, even though the South was winning. The South was trying to win the first day because Grant was waiting for reinforcements. They came the second day, and the North won the battle. They won the battle, but lost, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 more men than the South did. So, Grant, it's a story about Lincoln. I think it's true, but I'm not sure. It's a good story, even if it's not, where Grant was known to be kind of reckless. And some of Lincoln's advisors would say, this Grant, he's reckless. He takes chances. He loses a lot of men. He's a drunkard. And Lincoln supposedly said, well, that may be, but what I'd like you to do is find a cask of Grant's favorite whiskey and send it to all my generals so they can win their battles. My last tip is going to be saving something for next time. And I'd hoped we would have time in Nashville to see some things. I really wanted to see, first of all, on the left, Ann Patchett's was a famous writer, her bookstore, Parnassus Books. I really wanted to see that. At the top there, I would love to have seen Broadway. Didn't have time for that. But I really wanted to go to Nashville because I really want to see the Parthenon. And you go, wait, Dave, Parthenon's in Athens. But no, Nashville's nickname is Athens of the South, and they've reconstructed for a World's Fair 100 years ago, whatever. They reconstructed the Parthenon, not just the exterior, but the interior too, with the golden statue of Athena. So I'm going back to Nashville one of these days, and I'm going to see some of these things. But for now, that was the trip.
The end.
The end.
On that note, thank you so much for that road trip, Dave. But I have to ask though, do you have a wow moment from this trip?
Oh man. I would say I'm a Gemini, so it's hard for me to pick one. The burnt ends at Joe's in Kansas City, those are right up there. and then standing on that balcony at the Lorraine Motel. But even more than that, I think to me is this idea that we live in this big country. There's a lot of polarity now, but we're all Americans, and I think it's so important to travel in Europe, in the US, and just get to know each other. That only makes us stronger.
Well, thank you, Dave. And I just, your trip, I would say I was reflecting on this presentation while we were putting it together. And one of the things that you showed me that, our mission statement is to empower Americans to have culturally broadening, fun, and affordable trips in Europe. But you have definitely proved to me that you can do so in our own backyard. If you can't make it to Europe, there's just so much culture to experience in this country. And for the past several weeks, us M&T hosts actually have been asking our viewers to submit their favorite travel memories or hidden gems across the American South. And so I actually have put them together into a little,
Fantastic.
yeah, a little
Yeah.
mini travel guide, a la the Monday Night Travel Community. And so we will start in Oxford, Mississippi. Our first submission is from Diane Kay, who grew up in Mississippi, and she wrote to us saying, "You absolutely have to include square books in this presentation." And she wrote just saying that Oxford is an amazing place. It is a literary town and the home of William Faulkner and John Grisham. And back in 1979, this little bookstore called Square Books opened on the Courthouse Square in Oxford. And being a Pacific Northwest girl through and through, I've not spent much time in the South yet, but Diane let me know that, as with many Southern towns, the Courthouse Square is the center of activity.
Oh, that's a great tip. I walked by this bookstore, but it was closed. I didn't have a chance to go in, but that's what a great tip.
Yeah, something for next time.
Yeah.
And this special bookstore, it is a pillar of the Oxford and University community dedicated to not only offering literature on the South that you may not find in another commercial bookstore, but it also is a destination for authors all over the country. Over the years, they've even hosted writers like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. And Diane, a self-described avid reader, called her visit here magical in 2024. And I also just want to thank the fine people of Square Books for providing these photos. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Nice.
And our next submission is from William Betts, who actually went on his own Southern road trip in November of 2020, which included a stop at the USS Cairo. And for those of you who may not be Civil War buffs, the USS Cairo captured Fort Pillow, a Confederate garrison, in June of 1862, which enabled Union forces to occupy Memphis. And just 6 months later, the Cairo was sunk while clearing mines for the attack on Haines Bluff, which made the Cairo the first ship ever to be sunk by a mine remotely detonated by hand.
Wow.
And William also drove some porches of the Natchez Trace, which is a 440-mile scenic drive that connects Natchez, Mississippi with Nashville. And it roughly follows one of the oldest roads in North America, the Old Natchez Trace, which was used by Native Americans for travel and trade as far back as 10,000 years ago.
Wow.
And here is just some of the beauty that you may encounter along the Natchez Trace. And then Edward M. wrote in that a wonderful surprise on his trip to Greenville, South Carolina, was discovering that there are beautiful waterfalls right in the center of town. Our next travel memory is from my dear Aunt Sydney, who is also a Monday Night Travel fan. And a couple years ago, she went from Charlotte, North Carolina to Savannah, Georgia on a road trip with several of her friends. And
I'd love to do that.
yes, I know, me too. And she shared that her wow moment was actually this alleys and hidden passageways tour that she did in Charleston. And she said that exploring these smaller spaces, accessible only by foot traffic, gave a much more intimate look at Charleston. And she felt like she saw the city on just a much smaller scale. And then she also shared that just her friends and herself fell in love with the architecture that they saw all along the way, including the giant dresser at the Furnitureland store in Greensboro, North Carolina.
It's awesome.
It was an important site. And our last submission is from me. Several years ago, I had some time off, and my fiance had a week-long convention in Disney World Orlando. And so, of course, I decided to tag
Of
along.
course.
And Rick always encourages Americans to get beyond Orlando. And so I did. And I found this beautiful and historic little neighborhood called Winter Park, Florida, um, within Orlando proper. And it's just full of these amazing southern mansions that, and talk about architecture.
Mhm.
I'm not used to seeing buildings like this in the
Beautiful.
Pacific
Yeah.
Northwest. But I would say the thing that makes Winter Park truly unique is that it's set along this chain of six lakes that are all connected by these man-made canals. And I believe back in the 19th century, they were originally used just for transportation because there weren't really roads that existed in that area yet. And they also, I believe, used it to transport logs to a mill. But today, you can take these really fun tours of all of the canals. It reminded me of like the real life Jungle Cruise from Disney World.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just a really fun way to spend an afternoon if you find yourself in Disney World and need to get out of the theme park.
Need to cleanse. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Well, that brings us to the portion of our evening where we share the word from our sponsor. And this evening, it is, of course, Rick Steves Europe's maps made by the one and only Dave Hoerlein. And if you have used any of our maps, you are looking at the work of one Dave Hoerlein. Dave has produced our country maps, our tour maps to the itinerary route maps that you've seen on screen here.
I would say that we have a team of map makers now. It used to be just me doing it. Now we have Sandra, Oren, Mary, Lauren, a team of people that do it. So yeah, it takes a village to get it all done. We have so many books and so many maps.
Thank you. And one thing that you did mention to me earlier is that you love the natural silliness that our company has. And
Yes.
I I just love these maps because I think they just encapsulate our brand so well. And I just think your natural creativity and whimsy just like I just love how your fingerprints are all over this.
Oh, thanks so much. And the maps used to be all hand drawn, and then photoshopped and all that. But of course, now we use the program Illustrator, so they're more digital and more precise, maybe a little less personality than they used to have.
Well, still, they are extremely handy tools for our travelers.
Thanks.
You've probably seen the city maps in our guidebooks or the color maps, the actual physical maps that you will find attached at the end of our guidebooks. But I would also say that my favorite work by Dave is the retirement maps that he creates for retiring Rick Steves Europe employees. And each one that he makes is a unique design for that person, and he uses phrases and words that describe the retiree that he collects from our staff to go into these beautiful maps. And I always, whenever we have a retirement party, my favorite thing to do is go check out the map that Dave made. And this one here was for our TV producer, Steve Camarano, who retired last spring.
Yeah, we have a retirement coming up Wednesday, I think. So we'll be unveiling a new map.
So I can't wait to see what you've come up with. Well, now Ben has been busy behind the scenes collecting questions
Can hardly
for,
wait.
for Dave. And I do have to say, he mentioned that there have been a lot of compliments on your hair.
Jeez. I decided some years ago to not to try and make it behave because I have a cowlick and stuff. And so it just kind of goes a little wild. But
Well, it's
I
your
thank you, I
signature
think.
look, yes. Okay, well, I think we will start off with a question that I really liked from Harry. He is wondering how this trip changed your perception of our country.
Gosh, I think living in the far, northwest corner of our country, you sort of get to use that's what the US is. But of course, it's a very large country with a lot of different perspectives. And I think it just made me realize that we all need to travel more. I feel like my life has been so focused on Europe, 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 which is fabulous. But in our own backyard, there's so many things you can see. And I know, for example, we invited our hosts at Oxford to come to Seattle sometime, because we live in a great country with so much variety. And the more we travel, the better it is.
Yeah, and I love that you just have made all these connections now through the South. And I think that is just so important that we, you know, during this very polarized time, just make an effort to actually talk to different peoples and different cultures.
Exactly, because if you believe all the things in the media, we're all so different. But no, we're not so different. We're very similar.
Well, that is beautiful. Thank you. Um, Gary, we keep talking about Caravaggio. He would like to know what other Caravaggios have you seen, which I'm sure you've seen dozens probably, but
Yeah.
do you have a favorite Caravaggio?
Gosh, honestly, I think the one in Kansas City is right up there. I love the subject. Let's see. The one in the Louvre is also good. The see the it's the Dormition of the Virgin. I think that is. There's a couple in Florence. Yeah, the one I really want to see is going to be the hardest one to see, and it's in Malta. Oh, place. So unless I take a cruise, I'm going to be hard pressed to get to Malta. But
You
one of
might
these
be on a
one,
cruise.
one of these days.
Because I love the one of him in the Borghese Gallery where he's holding a basket of fruit. I
Oh,
believe
oh
there's just,
yes, the Bacchus. Yeah,
yes, there's just something about it that feels so modern to
yeah.
me. I don't know. I just felt very connected to him when I saw that portrait. All right. Brent is wondering how much time you would recommend blocking out for the World War One museum.
Oh boy, I would say we were there 2 or 3 hours. I think you could easily spend that much time. Yeah. I mean, every exhibit has different things and it's very multimedia. And yeah, I'd say 2, 3 hours would be a good average.
Mhm. All right. And George is wondering if you have a favorite map that you've created,
Oh gosh.
or maybe just a
Oh,
favorite city that just because of the layout. I know you like urban design.
yeah, I think my favorite map would be the fold-out map that I did for our Italy for Food Lovers book, because it shows all of Italy with little bubbles that kind of point to each region that talk about each specialties of Liguria or Tuscany and all that. And then the backside is little fun little graphics like an Italian gelato diagram and a coffee diagram and different things like that. So it's a yeah, that book and the back of the Food Lovers book, that map in the back of the Food Lovers book would be my favorite.
Yeah, I love that book. I went on our South Italy tour last year
Oh,
and
nice.
I studied it religiously because I've learned that when you're traveling in Italy, like a lot of places in Europe, it really is about eating the regional food. And so that is a great tool
Exactly
for
right.
all Italian travelers to have. All right. I think we have time for one more question.
See if you can stump the band.
Ah, okay. Somebody by the name of JD is wondering on this trip what your favorite city was and your favorite food, and what place would you most like to return to spend more time? And I know you mentioned Nashville at the end of
Yeah,
this. So,
Nashville, I would
yeah.
love to go. I really loved Memphis. There was just a great vibe there. And as far as the meal, oh, it's a toss up between those two in Kansas City, the steak at Jess and Jim's or the barbecue at Joe's. Yeah, they were both really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, as somebody who recently had true Southern barbecue for the first time in Austin, I
Oh,
also was blown away by how delicious barbecue was.
yeah. I don't know a lot about barbecue. I know it varies quite a bit. The Kansas City, my understanding is it's more tomato sauce based, where Memphis tends to be more of a dry rub. And I don't know
Hmm.
the Austin style, but if you're a barbecue aficionado, oh boy, the
You're
South
in
is
for a
heaven.
treat. Yes. All right, Dave. Well, I think that takes us to the end of our show.
Okay.
And I want to thank you so much for joining us on Monday Night Travel, for reliving this amazing trip you had with us, and just sharing all your expertise and all your
Thank
personality.
you so much. It was a
Yeah.
pleasure. It was a pleasure.
All right. Well, we do have more in store for all of you. If you are interested in our tours, please join us tomorrow night for our next Tours 101 information session at 6 p.m. I will be there, and I hope to see you there. And next week, Lisa Friend will be joined by Journeywoman CEO Carolyn Ray for a talk on solo female travel. So I hope to see you there as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.
Which artwork is your favorite, Emily?
That's a tough one. I do love that Velasquez, but I'd probably have to go with the iconic subscribe button painting. What about you?
Mine would either be Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights or ricksteves.com's Garden of Free Travel Resources. Or that portrait. Wow, it's beautiful.
It's a masterpiece. They look real.